Bam! MC is in the house. What's up, folks? My name is Justin Garcia, also known as Master Chim, and welcome to the Warrior Stream. I'm here every Wednesday at noon Eastern Standard Time, taking a topic deep dive and having a good time while doing it. And usually joined by a pretty consistent cast of characters. Appreciate you guys when you do join me for these talks. Before we get into it, let's take care of a little bit of housekeeping. Masterchim.com is my website, but if you want to get my daily emails, which all of you should, they're free. I send them every day. You can go to masterchimletter.com. If you're watching on one of the Facebook pages, YouTube, wherever you're picking this up, the links are also, all relevant links are also in the description. I got a lot of things that I do, a lot of things that I offer. But at a minimum, if you guys are interested in what I talk about, you have to get on my email list. That's where I really expand on many of the concepts that I talk on social media platforms, where admittedly, there is a lot of, obviously, there's a lot of restriction. There's a lot of, there are lines that if you cross, you wind up paying a consequence that just, ruins the party, so to speak. Case in point, in a couple of weeks, I have a Forge Your Cult event where we'll be getting into some dynamics to create a high-level loyalty in small group units, small group tribes. And some of the subject material there, I know I'd get in trouble if I were to put it on a regular social media platform. So it always pays to stay connected via the emails. So what do we got going on here? Jesse, what's up, brother man? Good to see you. You're on Saxa. Good to see you, darling. Two on Tom in the house. What's going on, brother man? Glad you made it. As you guys are watching, do me a favor, just chime in, say what's up. I always love seeing, the people that are hanging out with me. I always talk about how social media has so many limitations, and it's potentially so destructive in so many ways. And some of the use cases, or the applications rather, of social media that are beneficial, I would say, is number one, if you have your business tied to networking with strangers, it makes sense to be on social media, because that's how you're going to find prospective clients and customers, etc. But another way is to connect with people who in the real world virtually, to be able to stay in touch with people. Like there's a thing that we all understood, calling a family member that we were disconnected from, just calling one of our buddies that we haven't spoken to in a while. Well, a lot of that, a lot of those boxes could be checked in the various ways that social media allows you to connect. Here we are on a virtual call. I'm in Pennsylvania right now. Some of you guys are going to be all over the place, watching. So there is value there. I would say one of the big detriments of social media is when people start to really conflate the connections that exist online with the connections that exist in the real world. Or, and this is another one, people start to disproportionately value the online connections with people who they also know in the real world, right? There are plenty of people who, I unfollow people all the time. And one of the reasons that I unfollow people is they're just sharing shit that is a distraction that, in my very limited interaction with social media, causes an anomalous sort of interaction. I'm not on social media all day long. If you guys ever message me on Facebook, I'm never going to answer you, because I never even check the DM thing, the instant messenger. I don't even know what the fuck it's called anymore, but I don't check it, So when I do go to social media, I'm either posting or looking at people that I know in the real world, when I see distractions here and there, it's like I just get rid of it. If you're somebody who lives their life by, off the energy that they create by posting silly shit for strangers on the internet, listen, do you, by all means. It's just not something that I want to expose myself to. Like many people that are trying to climb their ladder, I got shit to do, so I try to not, waste too much time in that way, right? My man, Big Fred, good morning again. Big Fred's in one of my groups. We were chatting this morning early with the group. So today's topic. Tuan Tom says we are friends in the real world. We don't get a lot of time together. I like it. Absolutely. And, you know, it's funny. A guy like Tuan Tom, and most of you, if you follow me, you know who Tuan Tom is. You don't need to know me, who I am, to know who Tuan Tom is, Tom Kyer. Guys like Tuan Tom are the people that I want to spend more time around. Finding ways to make that productive is one of my goals. It's like, how do I talk about the things that I want to talk about, deal with the people I want to deal with, and still fulfill all my obligations, as a father, as a husband, as a brother, etc. And, listen, I'm far from fucking perfect, but that is the plan, right? That is the direction that I move in. And a perfect example, a talk like today, and this should be a pretty good talk that I've planned. A guy like Tuan Tom being here is incredibly valuable because of the experience that he has. So that's the thing. When you talk about valuable issues, when you contemplate, valuable topics, you tend to have valuable people gravitate towards you, and you wind up building valuable alliances as a result. So let's get into it today. The topic of today is the weakness of resentment. Now, those of you who know me know that I'm a very big fan of Friedrich Nietzsche and his idea of resentment as it's, articulated. I very functionally just use interchangeably with resentment. I think the roots are the same, the intentions are the same, and any nuanced differences I don't really think holds enough weight to consider, in a talk like this at least. I created a framework for today's talk to sort of just corral me and keep me on mission. But the basic idea of it is I'm somebody who is opposed to championing weakness. I'm somebody who has plenty of weaknesses himself, which I never want to sort of get misconstrued when I'm talking about topics like this. I'm not somebody that has every single issue squared the fuck away. But there is no issue that is weak that I sit here using my power to defend. So there's one of the things that, that I always want to put out there. It's that you're not somebody that needs to be perfect. You're somebody, though, that needs to understand there's a right direction to move and a wrong direction to move. And your intent, if not your actions, also should reflect that, right? And that's the name of the game. So if we're talking about, rejecting weakness, it's important that we understand what terms are. The term weakness, and I've used this before, is a rejection of the pursuit of strength. It is not what rung of the ladder you find yourself on, but whether or not you believe, advocate, and participate in climbing. If we use that metaphor of an individual's ladder of strength, representing, the ascent representing an improvement or self-actualization and empowerment, whatever currency you want to assign to it, to the progression, strength is believing in that process and choosing to participate in it. Weakness is the opposite. Weakness is not only not participating in it, but even worse, it's the person who condemns the ladder. Look at all those idiots, And when you look at virtues that are built around weakness, resentment is one that's at the core of it, right? So I gave Johnny Groove, what's up, brother, man? Just so you, I gave a definition of weakness this morning in today's email. I just want to read it. For resentment, rather. So resentment is the bitter, lingering emotion of envy and self-pity, rooted in perceived injustice or inadequacy that poisons growth and diminishes self-power. One more time. Resentment is the bitter, lingering emotion of envy and self-pity, rooted in perceived injustice or inadequacy that poisons growth and diminishes self power. So, when I put that it is the combination of envy and self pity, it's the formula that I think we need to consider when talking about what resentment is. Envy, to be envious, we obviously know is to look at somebody and say, we should have that. They don't deserve that. We deserve it more than them at some point. And this is reflected in today's thumbnail. One would say things like, it's not fair. This isn't fair. And people that have values that are empowered, fueled by things like envy, there is that sentiment of, there being this fairness that's not being abided by. Like somehow the universe has decided to opt out of its own rule set and do you harm, on an individual basis. Sort of like the expectations that we have are the exact representation of the inevitable. And when that doesn't work its way out, there's somebody to blame, some individual, some entity, what have you. Some identity is having their name written on why that is the way it is. When we get into self-pity, then it is also that concurrent feeling of woe is me. I am worthy of compassion. I am worthy of people looking at me in a way that they are compelled to help. And when you have those two things together, we start looking at resentment. So I decided to think of 5 points, right, that I wanted to discuss today to frame this talk. And I'm going to start with, the whole premise of these 5 talking points is why resentment is weakness. And obviously, we're assuming that weakness is something that you don't want to emulate. Weakness is something that you do not find to be virtuous in and of itself, or you're not going to have an easy time agreeing with me, because that is the premise that I'm operating from. So why resentment is weakness, right? Number 1, resentment is reactive, not proactive. Resentment arises as a reaction to perceived injustices or inadequacies rather than as an intentional action. It blames others or external circumstances instead of taking ownership. And it doesn't look to find solutions. And what winds up happening is because it is so reactive, it leaves an individual powerless, stagnant, with an inability to use their own tools. We have two on Tom here. In SIOC, they have the power, I guess it's a paradigm, it's a system, it's a framework of the feeder and receiver dynamic. And the feeder is the person who initiates the exchange, the person who leads the dance, the person who is determining the outcomes that are going to follow. The receiver is the one who is, on the opposite end of that. They're the one who is following the lead. They're the one who is experiencing the outcomes that were dictated by the feeder. This idea of being active instead of reactive, proactive instead of reactive, is at the heart of why resentment is weakness. It does not allow you to sort of identify who you are and what you're supposed to be doing, but rather chooses and sort of lays in wait for somebody to do something that strikes some sort of reactive emotion. And that is how we then construct our missions. We're always sort of getting somebody back. We're always undoing something that somebody else did. We're always getting what somebody took from us, getting something that somebody took from us. We don't want to be in a position where we are so devoid of a mission that the only way we could find a purpose is if somebody gives it to us, right? So number 1, resentment is reactive, not proactive. Number 2, resentment drains energy from growth. The mental energy spent on resentment could be directed towards self-improvement, towards learning, towards overcoming challenges. Resentment traps an individual in this sort of cycle of negativity. It prevents them from channeling frustrations into productive action. There's something to be said for the motivation that occurs when one experiences friction, when one is coming into contact with conflict. Well, the thing about resentment is that it sits there just contemplating how reality should be some other version of what it is. And the expenditure of the energy in that meditative process does not produce a return. Therefore, it's a waste. If we are putting our energy, our resources more generally in a given direction, in a given endeavor, and there is nothing positive that's coming back, then that is a waste. And I would say the one thing that all wasteful habits like resentment give people that sort of confuses them enough or distracts them enough to where they keep doing it is the catharsis, right? So some people will resent other people, resent certain actions beyond their control. And the resentment in those cases wind up making them feel better. But making somebody feel better doesn't necessarily absolve the root cause of what made them feel bad in the first place, right? If you were in the sinking Titanic and I served you the best steak you've ever eaten, we have to ask ourselves, is there a greater context that should be given priority in this situation? So sometimes the short-term, cathartic feedback of being resentful sort of washes out or blinds one to the larger context that is actually designing their life, right? Two on Tom writes, we need to accept that people are to a great extent pre-made when you met them. They are not making changes to who they are quickly. If someone disappoints you greatly, the fault is yours. That's right. And I absolutely agree. And I would add to that, there are people who might be making changes when you're making changes, but there is a pace to be considered. There is a rate to be considered, a rate of change. I'll give you an example in martial arts, right? I started with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in like 2001 and 2001, I think the end of 2000, whatever it was. There are a lot of people who were just as enthusiastic about training as I was, people that were just as enthusiastic about this whole martial arts journey that we had just begun. And slowly, they sort of get distracted. They get weighed down. There's just a pace they didn't keep up with. It was something that I was very motivated for. And I designed my whole life around the pursuit of my relationship with it. And the outputs were indicative of that. Whereas there were people who had all the best of intentions, but for whatever reason, just being them did not allow them to maintain the pace that I was keeping in this one given discipline. It's not that they were worthless because they didn't train as much as I did or commit to it as much as I did. It's really just a commentary on the offset. And sometimes when we set expectations, people let us down, but the expectations we set were probably too high to begin with, right? And every single time somebody lets us down, that is really a cue for us to reset those expectations. If this is an ongoing recurring theme in your life, then maybe we need to address and upgrade the actual expectation designing formulas that we're running, right? I use the phrase, that one of my Princess Bride references, men of action, right? We are men of action. If you consider yourself to be a man of action, there really shouldn't be any delusions that are getting in the way of you building a more effective relationship with reality. There's still people to this day that, those last couple of years during the pandemic, it's like, no, doctors would never lie. They would never do something just for money. A guy like, a Fauci or somebody, they would never misrepresent themselves. They would never do harm to people. And it's really, I need to remind myself that these people don't have the relationship with reality that I do, because they're not necessarily against me or on the other side. It's just that they don't understand what people are capable of. When you do understand what people are capable of, that's when I use the term men of action. And we tend to not fall for those same delusions, right? So sometimes, there are subconscious biases that prevent us from readjusting those expectations. But I would say that it's never going to hurt when somebody builds a better, more constructive relationship with understanding the reality that they're a part of, right? Judge Cohen, what's going on, brother man? So far, number one, resentment is reactive, not proactive. Number two, resentment drains energy from growth. Number three, resentment relinquishes control. When somebody resents somebody else, they give control of their emotion to the other person. They give control of their emotions in a more general sense to external factors. This surrender of the emotional sovereignty that an individual should have weakens the individual's ability to influence their own life and obviously the circumstances that surround it. We are somebody who we are people who work so hard on getting ahead, on making progress. And so much of that, I would say more than most people remotely even realize, so much of that is controlled by who we are, the state that we maintain, the attitude, the paradigm, the belief systems, the standards, so many internal factors. Well, when we're somebody who is fueled or even worse, led by resentment, we relinquish those internal controls to external circumstances, a lot of times to people who the very purpose or point of the resentment is that we identify these people as not wanting our better interest, people who don't want us to succeed. We resent them, but the irony, the paradox of it is we give those very people control over us, control over our emotional states, right? Our ability to do our job in a way that benefits us, right? Two on Tom writes, we should also account for the lack of self-knowledge people have that suck at knowing themselves. That's right. And I would say a big driver of that is the lack of a system of feedback, right? They don't have people that they trust to tell them about themselves. They don't have the ability to sort of have this meta perspective on their own biases, their own preferences, the mistakes that they make, the tendencies that they have in good and bad directions. And because of that lack of self-awareness, they wind up just having a very emotionally driven approach to trying to better themselves. Progress feels good in those people's minds. And sometimes they have this sort of cyclical relationship with negative outcomes based on, bad formulas or completely unknown biases that they have no access to, right? So Tom writes, this resentment is slave morality. It is receiver. Absolutely. Absolutely. I remember a couple of years ago on the Pressure Project, my old podcast, we did an episode on master versus slave morality and talking about the distinctions to be made and why I think Nietzsche was such a genius. But one of the things about the slave morality, like receiver, when we hear slave morality, the receiver concept, the person who is weak, who is being told what to do or controlled, that is a surface level indication of what slave morality is. As you start getting into Nietzsche's work specifically, he then gets into the entire virtue system that results of this morality. This idea that because you are the one that is suffering, you are somehow the more moral individual, right? It's why individuals have a tendency to root for underdogs. It's why, and this is, I remember an experience with Two on Tom. We were watching a pretty serious video about, somebody who was about to have their head separated from the rest of their body, right? And I remember Two on Tom just making it. We were with some military guys at the time, and Two on Tom made a great observation that, it's funny how most people immediately identify with the person being attacked. And then certainly there's some overlap if the person being attacked looks more like you than the person doing the attacking. But how this could change if you just change the narrative, and if you tell a made up story about how the guy doing the violence is a good guy and is protecting this bad guy, how the guy who's having the violence done to him is this, just plague on society, this, mutilator of children or raper of women, and like all these different, just we could add this narrative. We realize the act itself doesn't mean anything. But at our default, most of us opt for one instead of the other. And I would say a lot of that has to do with how we see ourselves in that dynamic. Who are we? Are we the person more likely to do the violence or have the violence done to us? And all these biases tend to create a worldview and a narrative that in this modern society does have us gravitate more towards a slave morality. It's like if you ask somebody right now, would you rather be a slave or a slave master? And I'm talking, just doesn't have to be American slaves. It could be fucking 1,000 years ago slaves somewhere in Europe. But if you could be a slave or a slave master, some people, because of the biases that today's society has installed in them in terms of morality, they will opt for being a slave, and I think such a choice could not be more unnatural, as an animal looking to survive, thrive, propagate itself as a species, on this planet, to say that we would rather have all of our agency and autonomy removed from us rather than be the person who does such a thing to somebody else is unnatural, and it's a mental exercise. It's a hypothetical. It's like, I would never say be a slave master, because, well, you don't have to, at the end of this, you're not buying a slave, it's literally just a hypothetical, but even hypothetically, they wouldn't look to sort of sit in that seat when given those two options, and that, again, that's a commentary on the deficiencies of modern philosophy and modern morality, So, number 4, resentment thrives on envy and comparison, right? Number 4 of 5 of why resentment is weakness. It thrives on envy and comparison. You see, resentment often stems from comparing ourselves to others, which is a sort of self-imposed level or metric of inadequacy. Somebody else is always going to be better at being them than we are at being them. So to compare ourselves to other people already puts us at a deficiency. It only makes sense then when done, at a higher scale or consistently over time, is going to produce envy, right? You see, by focusing on others, individuals ignore the strengths that they have that are unique, because they're obviously, everybody has their strengths and what I would say future strengths, maybe also weaknesses, but sometimes we're on the ladder. We're just not at the point where it's functional. I would call those future strengths. When you're focusing on others, you're ignoring those aspects of you as an individual. It ignores the opportunities that you have to improve. If you're always comparing yourself to other people, if you get to the point where that comparison has you start to generate envy for that person, well, what does that say about the awareness that you have at any given moment as to the opportunities that are laying in front of you? When you are so preoccupied about what all these other people have, how is that not immediately taking some of your bandwidth away from the opportunities that you have, right? So number 4, resentment thrives on envy and comparison. Tuhan Tom, if you are a slave master, you are in control. Treat your slaves however you want or choose to free them. That's right. That's right. And it's funny how, we've done these exercises and these conversations, me, working with SIOC and with STG and Tuhan Tom, as long as I have, the amount of training that I was exposed to with so many of these dynamics finding the seams, the openings, the weaknesses, the vulnerabilities of people who otherwise are looked at as pillars and models of strength and capability. It's really mind-blowing how these seams exist in people that you would just assume they're completely squared away. You find the guy that is a man amongst men, this sort of superhero archetype of individual who you put him in the right emotional state and he becomes useless. There was a point where, and this again is piggybacking on some PSYOC uh, technology, I would say. The readiness formula of PSYOC. One of the components being willingness. You look at modern society today, and there are people who are not ready for conflict just because they cannot muster enough willingness to do what needs to be done in a given situation. I remember years ago getting into an online argument when I was still doing that with a old high school classmate of mine. He wasn't necessarily a friend, but you guys know how Facebook is. Like, oh, I haven't seen this fucking idiot since '93, right? So you connect on Facebook and your buddies, and in this conversation, he and his wife, who were just like super left progressive crazy people, we're talking about gun rights and how nobody should have guns, and like, I get it. I was raised in New York. People who are raised in New York City are just, for the most part, maybe it's changed nowadays, but my upbringing, it's like only police and bad guys have guns. That's pretty much what you're told. And it wasn't a surprise then that they were anti-gun, but the level of sort of pathological, application, this belief system that they had, was just mind boggling to me. In one example, they had like a 1-year-old, and I made an example for the guy's wife, who was arguing with me more than the guy was, which, there's that whole thing. I had given her a scenario. I said, well, listen, I'm not saying that you got to go around with a pistol. I'm not saying that everybody should be, Old West, walking around with 6 shooters on their hips, etc. I said, but let's just say, you were in your house and your 1-year-old is there and somebody breaks in and has a knife, up in the air and says, I'm going to stab your newborn baby in the face with this knife. And you happen to have a shotgun sitting right next to you. And all you have to do is take it, point it, shoot it, and your baby's going to be safe. Obviously, you would shoot the guy. And obviously, this is just an argument on the internet, so this is not a real thing. But she said, absolutely not. My child would or would die knowing that they were not the cause of somebody else's death. And I could not think of a more dysfunctional philosophy for a newborn mother to have. Just think about how dysfunctional that is. I pretty much gave like a gimme, scenario where it's like, well, obviously there I would use it, at least bookending this so we could find a little bit more common ground somewhere in the middle. But she was not even willing to concede that. How do you have a conversation with somebody who says they're willing to let their children die rather than go against their beliefs? It's like, okay, good for you, I guess. I think when we look at who we are as individuals, it's not a mystery that our circumstances are going to be very compatible to what our belief systems are. And this goes well beyond the whole topic of resentment. It's a much more general statement. It's like if you take who you are, the decisions you make, the tendencies, the habits you have, et cetera, the biases you have, and you just, run them through a simulation, you wind up with the reality that you're looking at right now. And today I'm making the case of why resentment is such a negative factor in that actual application, right? Judge Cohen says many men have been trained to fear, even considering thinking about these concepts. That's right. It's inappropriate. It's in poor taste, whatever it is. And I think there's certainly an appropriate time and place to discuss these topics. But, I think, where my list of appropriate times and spaces would be would far differ from the average person's idea of it, the average man's idea of it. I agree with you. Tuan Tom writes, we all need tribe. Choose your tribe wisely. I tune into this talk because it makes me stronger. Me and the other 6 people watching are getting stronger. There's a point where when we're looking at what exactly we fill our head with every day, Tuan Tom and I, it's like whenever we're together in any way, it's like we always start talking about things at this level. It's like because both of us also know how many people we're surrounded by during the course of a day that really don't have an interest in these things. I have a great amount of pride in who my children are, who they're turning out to be. When you look at Tuhan Tom, you look at his children, it's like, yeah, that's a squared away group of young men. Well, why do our children sort of reflect those characteristics and those qualities? And I would say is because their dads, and their mothers, but their dads primarily are always talking about shit like this, are always concerning themselves with things that matter, as opposed to the sports game, the new, TV, the new phone, whatever, the new video game, whatever else, the consumerist materialistic, reality is out there just waiting to get you addicted to. It just makes sense that that's the case. And in this society, we are strong enough. Society is strong enough to shield you as a man. It won't always be able to, but you could, at this point, you could live a good 60, 70, 80 years without ever having to be worth a shit in this society, without ever having to deal with these things. But because you've never had to deal with them, there's never really been a consequence, for not dealing with them. Like most people in a modern society will not get into a knock them, drag them out, type of fight, where you and another person are trying to do each other serious bodily harm. Some people will never have one of those exchanges. Well, there was a time where that was so commonplace to not have at least a relationship or an agenda in that type of situation would be to the detriment of you and everybody that relies on you. You had a responsibility at a certain time to understand how to do violence on your behalf, even if it's grabbing your shotgun and going, get off my property. Whatever the case is, people had a relationship with violence that allowed them to be functional. Nowadays, you can get away with not doing it. You can get away with recruiting third-party, violence agents, the people that are willing to do violence on your behalf, that absolve you of not only having to be good at it, but also grant you the ability to sit there and make fun of it and chastise it and condemn it. It's obviously so ironic. Monk, what's up, brother man? Happy New Year to you. Monk says because their parents are good and strong anti-war folks. Absolutely. Right on. I appreciate that. So let's get into the last point here, right? So just to rehash, number one, this is why resentment is weakness. Number one, resentment is reactive, not proactive. Number two, resentment drains energy from growth. Number three, resentment relinquishes control. Number four, resentment thrives on envy and comparison. And finally, for the last one, number five, resentment reinforces victimhood. Resentment encourages a victim mentality. It's like you have individuals who see themselves as oppressed, as wronged, rather than empowered to rise above the challenges that are in front of them. When you see an individual who values his victimhood, you will never see him champion anything that makes him heroic. I've said before, an observation I've made, that so many people want to be considered heroes today without slaying dragons. So what they've done is they've redefined what dragons are. They make up these imaginary boogeymen scenarios, and they combat those scenarios and then want the hero's share of credit for doing so. Well, when you have an individual who sees themselves as a victim, they are always going to perpetuate victimhood. They're always going to perpetuate weakness because that is the currency that they trade on. The cost of that, however, is you're denying personal responsibility. You're denying the opportunities you have to strengthen yourself. You're denying the capacity for self overcoming. When you champion the philosophy or the characteristic of victimhood, of being a victim, it then on the opposite end condemns true heroic action. You start looking at functional heroes as they were intended to be. You start looking them as disruptive elements rather than models of excellence. We start to condemn and reject those people that believe in self-reliance, that believe in loyalty, that believe in any sort of tribal identity. Tribalism, the very term tribalism. I remember I have one of my coaching students, when I started talking about, tribal dynamics and such, and he has a crew of employees. He was very hesitant to use the term tribe. And he had asked me, is there another term we could use? Because, people hear tribe and tribal and they tend to get the wrong idea. And I said, well, listen, you do what the fuck you want, but you're talking to the guy who wrote a book called TRIBALNOMICS. So obviously I'm a little biased. I just think we should be a little more reluctant to give up words to people who are not being intellectually honest. They don't get to say what this is. Like how many people just watching this have been accused of being racist, homophobic, Islamophobic, this phobic, that phobic, and it's just words that are used to recruit people against you. The validity of the narrative that they're using to recruit each other, or that whole crew with, doesn't have to be validated. You just get enough people to sign on, and there you have force to overcome yours. So I'm very hesitant to give away language. For me, an individual who understands what tribe is, doesn't get bogged down by the terminology in that way. And again, I'll use the concept of just intellectual honesty. You'll find many people with dysfunctional philosophies treating every discussion as, rather than an exposure of their ideas to conflict and scrutiny, they see it as a debate, a competition, right? Well, like I used to compete. I used to be a grappling competitor. I used to fight MMA, and there are plenty of grappling matches where I beat people who were better at jiu-jitsu than I was. They were better at grappling than I was, yet I beat them at the grappling match. Well, how's that possible? Because it's only ever going to be a representation of a rule set. It's not the truth of who's doing what, right? It's not the truth of who's actually superior. It is just our understanding of the system meant to measure it. So if you could have individuals that will sit there and try to break you down because of the terminology you use, and the volatility of this term, and the trigger warnings, and everybody's getting offended and stuff, they never have to actually deal with the substance of what you're trying to argue. And those people are silly. Those people should be treated as silly. In the I guess the intent of being respectful, what's wound up happening, what has wound up happening in society is we allow people to have a voice and a seat at the table that don't belong there. And it's not saying we should censor anybody. It's we should mock them. We should call them silly. And I've gotten banned, blocked, throttled down, and all these other things on social media because I do, not subscribe to a lot of the controls that people are trying to put over our language, right? So let's see. Monk says there's a lot of profit in victimhood. Ain't that the truth? Ain't that the truth? It's funny. I've been telling stories, not that I'm the great, fucking reporter on the street here or what have you, but I've been talking about the corruption in New York City for years. What I'm just used to, like what my experience was. Everybody's an envelope away, from getting what they want. And I think that, you look at the controversy and all of the corruption that's being exposed now in New York, there's still people who, number one, are acting like they didn't think this was possible. And then there are still other people who don't even believe it, even though it's right in their face. And I'm the one arguing this is the way it's always been, because people are placated, by the most trivial, meaningless means. It's like, I will use your words, and you think I'm on your side. I will believe or say that I believe in your lunacy, and you consider me an ally. Like, it is just a dysfunctional way to conduct oneself. Judge Cohen says tribe is the most successful form of human cooperation in the history of mankind. Absolutely right. Rashad says truth always comes to light. And it should, and there are some people who, speaking on truth, it's just information, and I think we do ourselves a disservice when we treat truth as a universally valued, currency. If they only knew the truth, and then people find out the truth and they still don't do anything. I think the information is there. I think the capability is there for men to not just rely on truth. And I'm not countering what you're saying there, Rashad, just adding to it, that the truth is a good first step. But ultimately, people are always going to do what they're going to do, whether you know it or not, right? We think about all the, and I'm not going to go through the list, but all the conspiracies that existed online for decades that over time were revealed to actually be accurate. And the chief argument against considering those concepts earlier on was just how ridiculous they were at face value. Almost like these things are so ridiculous and so improbable, they're not even worth dealing with. Yet so many of those things that met that criteria of its critics eventually were shown to be true. So truth is a funny thing. I'm somebody that believes in tribe. I'm somebody that believes in alliances. Like, we get better over time. I know it's certainly been my experience where I get better over time valuing, or maybe auditing is a good way to say, the alliances that I have. I know what strong allies look like. I know what weak allies look like. I know what fair weather friends look like. And I know what people who are so loyal, they're loyal to a fault of their own look like. People like, I have people that I'm friends with that they're so loyal that I'm almost grateful that they met me before meeting some other piece of shit that was just going to take advantage of them. But that's our journey to travel, right? So let me get Rashad in here. He says it takes work people want to avoid. Got to have the right people around you. Absolutely the truth. Absolutely the truth. And it's never as big a circle as people think it is. I'm a big believer in Dunbar's number, right? And 150 is the easy number that we could use. It's like 150 people total. And in that 150 people, there are concentric circles that get closer and closer to you. The people that are trying to, have the world love them and treat the stranger as well as the neighbor, like, you just run dysfunctional formulas. But I appreciate you guys for watching. My voice is almost done. Good talk, I think. I went through what I wanted to. And if you guys aren't getting my emails, make sure you hit that link in the description and sign up. They're free. But regardless, it's out. I'm happy to be back after a couple of weeks from the holidays being off. They just happen to fall on Wednesdays. But I will be here next week. And as always, brothers and sisters, pressure to power.